It began with a tiny bite on my ankle in the dark hours. I was barely awake when the sharp sting struck, yet I continued on to use the restroom. After I finished, I paused in the bright room to inspect my leg and dabbed away a small drop of blood with a damp cloth. I assumed I had grazed it against the bed's edge or a nearby storage box. I never suspected the true cause of that incident or the risk I was facing. I'm juggling several jobs right now, a full-time position, a part-time gig, and a short Sunday shift, which leaves hardly any time for rest. My only goal is to save enough money to buy a home and retire early. It's disheartening that such a simple dream seems nearly out of reach for someone my age. I live in a rented room in a modest 3-story building. Originally, the apartment housed 3 of us, but one roommate left, and now our landlord plans to convert the lower level into extra rental space. I must find a new place before those changes take effect. I already struggle with little sleep, and I doubt I could manage another roommate, especially one like Marcus. I had long suspected that Marcus handled his rent in shady ways. In this tough economy, people do what they must. Yet his habits made living with him a constant headache. He was noisy at night, smoked in his own room, and often took food that wasn't his while inviting friends over for long stays. What irritated me most was having to share a cramped washroom and clean up after the mess he left behind. I even brought these issues up with our landlord, but he only told Marcus to cut back on smoking indoors. I was already worn out from endless work hours and an unpredictable living situation, though I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. One night, around 2 in the morning, I trudged home from work and collapsed into bed, ready for sleep before my next shift. A persistent scratching noise kept me alert, making me wonder if Marcus had picked up a pet in my absence. Listening carefully, I soon realized the sound wasn't coming from his room, but from beneath my own bed. Assuming a few small critters were to blame, I grabbed my phone to use as a light. Then I heard a heavy thump against my bed frame and scanned the room for any sign of movement. Aside from a slightly shifted storage box, everything appeared normal, and no clear source of the noise was found. Later, I heard Marcus crank up his music in his room. I knocked on his door, asking him to lower the volume, and he mumbled that he hadn't realized I was home. Although he continued making some noise, I finally managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I didn't expect to see him since he usually lingered in bed after I left for work. Instead, I found him pacing in the small kitchen, clearly agitated. "I know we don't get along, but you've taken my things," he snapped in a frustrated tone, looking unkempt from a sleepless night. I was confused, wondering if I'd accidentally used up the last of his condiments. Then he added that even his socks and the 3 bags of his supply were missing. I raised an eyebrow, thinking hardly anyone would want his old, worn-out socks. I suggested he might have misplaced them somewhere in his room, but he cut me off, insisting he had customers waiting on his product. His tone grew harsher, and I felt uneasy facing the day. I explained that I hadn't touched any of his belongings and wasn't involved in any theft. Marcus glared at me, convinced that my careful nature meant I wouldn't mix with the people who visited him. He recalled that he'd been alone when his items went missing, unless they were hidden in his cluttered space. He even wondered if one of his guests had made a copy of his key as a prank. I reminded him that his own disorder might be to blame, but he wasn't convinced. I assured him once more that I hadn't taken anything and noted that we had already asked for the locks to be changed to stop these issues. A few days later, some of Marcus's supply was discovered strewn in the hallway with torn bags lying open. I saw the scattered items as he stepped out to use the restroom, just as I arrived home in my work clothes. Fortunately, there were no traces of his premium goods on me, so I remained free of suspicion. We spent the next hour searching every corner of the building for any stray animal and making sure all entrances were secure. I truly believed we had solved the mystery, either a wandering critter or one of his visitors playing a trick. Days passed, and Marcus's mood grew increasingly sour. Though nothing from my small set of belongings was disturbed, my possessions were few. A couple of boxes holding old winter clothes and a basket for laundry, while his room overflowed with needless gadgets, countless unused shoes, and tangled LED lights. Every night I heard soft scratching, yet when I switched on a light, the sound vanished, leaving me to wonder if I was simply imagining things. I began to doubt my senses as no trace of any creature could be found, and the mystery remained unsolved. Then one evening, a fierce storm hit, forcing me to take a rare day off. The howling winds and driving rain kept everyone indoors, and soon the power went out, leaving only the occasional flash of lightning to illuminate the night. Worrying about the food in the fridge, I was oddly relieved that Marcus had already eaten most of his share. I quickly prepared a sandwich before the lunch meat spoiled and made my way upstairs. There, in the dim hallway, I found Marcus holding his phone as a makeshift lamp. I had kept a battery-powered lantern for such emergencies, and he greeted me with a curt, "What's up?" Without missing a beat, he demanded, "Where are all my things?" My phone cables, socks, blankets, even my gold chains, they're all gone. He added that his camera had been damaged too, which was strange since he hadn't had any visitors since the lock change. I protested that I hadn't taken anything, but his anger only intensified as he insisted something must be hiding in his space. He barked that in such a small room, there was nowhere else for his items to go. I remarked that the clutter in his room might easily conceal such items, and that I could even smell the mess from across the hall. He shot back, criticizing my own cleanliness while defending the security of his belongings. Then, unexpectedly, he mentioned a tacky decoration hidden under his bed that scared him every time he went to the restroom. I was surprised, having never noticed such an object before, and peered under my own bed out of curiosity. To my shock, there was a strange white shape pressed against the floor, wedged in the gap between the bed and the wall. As I stared, a pale, oddly cheerful smile emerged, a grin that resembled a cheap costume mask with too many teeth. In that instant, everything seemed to slow as the mysterious form suddenly rushed out from under the bed. It darted forward on all fours, leaving both Marcus and me in utter disbelief. Marcus cried out as he stumbled backward, and I rushed to help him, but the creature was unexpectedly strong. It latched onto his legs and dragged him away, leaving him to struggle helplessly. I shoved the bed aside in a desperate attempt to rescue him, only to find nothing but an empty floor and a few shifted boxes. Realizing I couldn't save him, I made the quick decision to leave the apartment. I drove to work and parked in the lot, sitting in my car as I watched the storm rage on while trying to process what had just happened. For several days afterward, I avoided going back, staying with friends instead. Eventually, I knew I had to confront the situation and return to an apartment that looked exactly as I had left it. The sandwich Marcus had knocked from my hand was left to decay in the hallway, and marks on the floor still told the tale of his fall. That night I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling and feeling an unshakable dread. Just as I began to drift into sleep, I sensed a weight on my chest and heard a faint sound. I sat up and discovered a tiny creature no more than 5 inches tall perched on my bed. It was clad in ragged pieces of cloth that smelled unpleasant, and its hands ended in sharp, dark claws. Before I could react, its mouth moved as if it were about to bite me. In a split-second decision, I grabbed a piece of pre-cooked bacon and pressed it into its mouth. The creature hesitated, clearly puzzled by this unexpected offering, and then began to chew it quickly. It soon scurried over to a container of bacon on my bedside table, nibbling at my fingers only slightly afterward. I felt a surge of relief that my quick thinking had averted a worse outcome. Over time, the creature's manners softened, and despite its eerie look, it started to behave more like a pet. I continued feeding it small portions, and although it still looked unsettling, it grew less aggressive. Yet after a week of routine meals, I found it collapsed in the hallway, weak and unresponsive. When I tried to move it to a safer spot, it snapped at my hand, forcing me to reconsider how to care for it. I thought about calling for help, but feared that doing so might worsen the situation if the creature returned. It was clear that stopping the feedings altogether would only provoke it, perhaps making me its next target. With no other clear option, I decided to take action immediately. I borrowed an old bicycle from Marcus, knowing he wouldn't miss it, and packed a duffel bag with what little I could carry. I pedaled carefully along quiet streets, mindful of anyone, watching and felt every jolt as the bag's straps dug into my shoulders. After a few blocks, I parked the bike in a secluded spot and unzipped the bag to free its contents. The little creature darted out and quickly sought shelter under the shadow of a large car, offering me a brief, almost friendly glance before disappearing into the night. I was left with a mix of relief and uncertainty as I watched it vanish. A few months earlier, a co-worker of mine had harassed a young employee, causing the poor person to quit, while the co-worker was later dismissed for another mistake. I later learned he continued to send unwanted messages, adding to the distress. I even once drove that man home before I truly understood his character. I can't say that Marcus deserved what happened, but the events still leave me with many unanswered questions. I wondered what could possibly justify such a grim outcome delivered by this tiny creature, especially when I still didn't grasp all of its abilities. It appeared to be confined to our area, as it hadn't been seen far from the building. I questioned how many more people might suffer because of its actions, and what sacrifices might be necessary to keep myself safe. The thought of authorities ever catching on both worried and puzzled me. I even imagined the chaos that might ensue if I ever found myself in trouble, perhaps even facing the creature in a confined space. Despite my fear, I began to feel a reluctant attachment whenever it reacted happily to a small treat. It was strange. Its comfort seemed tied to the simple pleasure of a snack. In the end, I was torn between genuine fear and a budding fondness for this peculiar being. After one meal, the creature reappeared, now marked with a grim stain. Reluctantly, I placed it inside a second-hand duffel bag I'd picked up at a thrift store, planning to dispose of it once I returned home. Back in my apartment, I struggled to bathe the creature and cover it with fresh linens, my body protesting from exhaustion. Finally, the small being curled up on my bed beside me, much like a quiet pet, and I felt an odd comfort in its silent presence.